So this is part 2 of my commentary and reflections on Proverbs chapter 28. I'll continue now with verse 5. Evil men understand not judgment, but they that seek the Lord understand all things. So this is a good opportunity now to expand on the idea of evil and its relationship to understanding judgment. Thus far, I've conceptualized evil as something that tends towards absence. It is the opposite of the 7 days of creation. Consolidation is not part of the experience. Oneness is not an end goal. Even among multiplicity, the desire to continue to find identities among that multiplicity and split them into further and further and further multiples until it is nothing, for the sake of nothing. I think this is the ultimate end of evil. So let's spend some time talking about the word understanding. From Old English, we have the word understandin', meaning to comprehend, to grasp the meaning of, perceive the sense of something. What I really want to do here, I've done this before, it's a useful exercise, to break it down into its components, the under, then stand-in, or standing. Now under, I think there's a few ways that we can think about this. If we say that something is under something else, we could say that it relationally or physically, in that related sense, can be under something else. So I'm looking at a thing of chapstick. It is physically under my keyboard, which rests on a shelf that is a little bit higher than it. In this way, I'm not sure that there's any parallel to the understanding that we are trying to explore. But in a meaningful sense, if I say that what I would sacrifice is first the chapstick and then the keyboard, because the keyboard means more to me than the chapstick, so I would readily give up the chapstick first. Then I think this approaches a little bit closer what we mean by understanding. For under, in this sense, is not just a physical relation, but a relation of value. So leaving that as it will, we'll come back to it. If we take the word stand, or stand-in the Old English, we can think about it physically, and I think that there are strong parallels to the physical and the sort of meaningful interpretation. For to stand upright, it is a position of strength. It is somewhat of a fortified position. It is a position of attention. And so if we take this position of attention and we apply it to various things, relationships, objects, whatever, and we analyze the relatedness among them based on their value, and I don't mean just in a cheap economic standpoint. I mean a much more sophisticated definition of what is valuable. That includes virtues, that includes evils, that includes goodness, that includes judgment. I think what begins to happen is that the mind grasps these relationships. It understands concepts in a more fundamental way. So, for example, if we were talking about the chapstick that's in front of me, there are plenty of things that I need to understand about its orientation. So I have it in front of me here. It happens to be in its casing. There's a certain... I need to be standing at attention. This is a bit of an overkill for such a simple example, but just to explore the point, I need to be at attention. I need to be in a posture of attention, such that I am aware of the various relationships that are afforded to this object. It's a very purposeful object. It is made by man. So it's in its package. In order to understand how to get to it, I need to understand how to open it. And so I move this little cardboard stopper, and it effectively opens the package. And I can move the little cardboard stoppers out of the way. And I found myself now in possession of the chapstick. The chapstick is taped over because it is something that has not been opened yet. If I were to open it, then I would find that material that I'm after to apply to my chapped lips that solves that dilemma. A series of meaningful or purposeful actions are required in order to get at the end. And it is a process that one undergoes to develop and to place together the various relationships necessary to execute, to fulfill the purpose of something, but also to fulfill the desire that we have. And insomuch as I am able to interact with this chapstick, I am afforded the ability or the opportunity to understand how to use it. So in what way, then, is an evil person completely barred from this experience? Now, if we say that a person is fundamentally geared towards absence, if I were to pick up this chapstick, I were to play the part of this evil person, what my mind would be focusing on, that posture of attention, would be not to use the object, but to reduce it to something that is not useful. Sort of the opposite. So, I would be able to understand how to interact with it only insofar as I disrupt or destroy its purpose. Perhaps I remove from the chapstick the moisturizing lip balm component. To do that removes much of the functionality behind this. And a person that wishes to understand or to go through that process of taking it out of the package and using it would not be able to. So it is not so much that the evil person cannot understand. What we're exploring here is the evil person not being able to understand judgment. So there's something, then, fundamentally about judgment, unlike the experience that we're talking about here with the chapstick, that makes it impossible to remove that inner core or that inner purpose. Now, without going into it in any particular detail, just thinking about the surface level, I would imagine, because if we were to make some equivalence between judgment and this chapstick, what's fundamentally inside of that judgment, which would be symbolized by the cylindrical tube that holds the lip balm, what's inside judgment is the truth. It's goodness. And this is not something that can be fundamentally destroyed. It is something that is, something that is true forever. It is a principle that stands independent of the very idea of absence. So today is a new day. And as I usually say, a new day, new thoughts. Now I'll pick up where I left off, and I'd like to add a little bit to how I finished that, because I think it's kind of incomplete. It's difficult to understand exactly what I mean. But just to get my mind focused, perhaps a reflection on the day may be fruitful. So it happens to be a Tuesday today, the middle of the week. And as I talked about in the previous chapter, there's a verse that really hits on this idea of perception, of the way that we think about rest, leisure, how we participate in the moment, and that if we are always looking forward to the future without paying attention to the present, that we deal with certain things, we find them to be unsatisfactory, we participate in a way that is unsatisfactory, our minds are perpetually burdened only to have a perceived relief on a Friday, on a Saturday, on a Sunday. And this way of thinking is unproductive. It's something that ruins the experience of life, for the majority of our hours are spent doing things that are not quite comfortable. They're not quite the type of leisure activities that I think many of us engage in, unfortunately. Not the type of leisure that expands the mind, which often involves, I think, a degree of suffering and sacrifice. But rather it's the leisure that tends towards absence of mind, whether it be drinking or just not thinking about anything. Now, this is not to say that I discount rest as an important aspect of our experience, but I say this to say that I need to remind myself that when the week is young, and I may be dreading all of the work that is in front of me until the weekend comes about, it is not because I should find myself in a state of laziness on the weekend that I look forward to it. And it is not because I am burdened by work and my attention is placed somewhere where it may find more enjoyment somewhere else. I think the correct orientation is that given one has a duty, something to accomplish, some goal, some end to pursue, that goal and that end ought to be pursued rightly, with goodness in mind, with the appropriateness of behavior, of character, of speech. And when that time for leisure comes, within that warm embrace of prudence, we ought to find ourselves engaged in something that is productive, and that it is not entirely leading to absence. And I'm well aware of where we left off and how we were talking about evil, that it is something that tends towards absence or nothingness. Now, there's a type of absence that may be thought of as temporary, which may not necessarily be conceived of as evil. But we do have one life to live in this form, in the way that we so highly value in the 21st century. Evil men understand not judgment. So to recap from yesterday, I went into this bit about understanding using the lip balm, and I made a comparison that, given that this lip balm, there's various steps that one must go through to get at the purpose or the primary end, the purpose of the lip balm. Judgment is a similar process. There's a principle that we are after. The principle is finding the truth. And like finding that chapstick beneath the cap within the container, our pursuit of judgment, I mentioned that at the core of it, it is good. At the core of it, it is true. I think judgment in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily have to be true. We can have false judgments. And there can be true judgments. But judgment, I think the purpose of judgment, is to decide on whether or not something is right or wrong, whether it is true or false. And regardless of whether or not we find ourselves on the rightful side of it or the wrongful side of it, if we are honest in our deliberation, in our attempts to understand, I think what we find under that head of the chapstick will fall in line according to our ends, I guess. Now, it's difficult to say, I guess, because on one hand, the purpose of judgment, the purpose of law, is much like the chapstick. We know why it was produced. Of course, we may find other purposes for it, or for the container that it rests in, which might be analogous to an institution. We can corrupt it. We can use it for some tyrannical purpose. But the thing in and of itself is made to prevent chapped lips. And again, I go back to that idea that judgment is meant to find the truth. Even in the case of the chapstick, we must accurately identify the purpose of the thing, the purpose of the concept, the purpose of the object, if we intend to do its opposite. Now, I'll add an addendum to that, because we're talking about the evil person now. To pick up the chapstick, or to use judgment, to flip it on its head, to use the chapstick instead of reducing the the dryness of one's lips, the device, the object is used in such a way to exacerbate the problem. It would be such a strange thing. Firstly, it would be an improper modality to do such a thing. It would make sense insofar as a person may identify that the chapstick is going to do something to solve their problem of chapped lips. The evil of the wicked person will tend to absence. So in order to tempt them into something that is contrary to what they wish or what they desire, contrary to some good, they wish to see it destroyed. So they will pervert the purpose of the thing for that end, for the absence of something. And again, at this level, it's kind of strange, but ultimately, absence of everything, just complete nothingness. So I raise the question again, how exactly is it the case that evil men understand not judgment? Well, again, I go back to the chapstick. A person that knows how to use the chapstick will use it for its intended purpose. A person that knows how to use judgment will use it for its intended purpose. And so the question is, well, how do we know that the intended purpose of judgment is towards that which is good, or that which is right? If it's truly to be the case that evil is something, a force that tends towards absence and disruption, and they are unable to understand judgment, we have to go back to our etymology of the word understanding. So that prefix under, before I said something that is of less value from a purposeful standpoint. This gets us into trickier territory too, because of the human agent, there's so much variability in how we attribute value to things. But there's also a way in which the human being can find value based on his experience that is independent of his desire, that's independent of his wishes. This is sort of the marker of God's will. Oftentimes this will, the way that things are not as we expect them to be. And matters of belief can be quite tricky, especially when they sour. It's very hard to find the way home if one is lost. If one is lost long enough, the very thought of going home, or to have that place for mind that truly understands peace, love, a harmonious productivity, I think that can fall by the wayside. But I don't want to get too far into the weeds. Understanding. Now, I said less in value. I can say below in value as more of a statement of measurement, maybe, in the sense that which is below something in value has to do with its purpose, the way in which it participates with us. Certainly, we would say that the way that the chapstick participates with us, or the way that we participate with the chapstick, is much different than our cell phone, which occupies a lot of our time, attention, energy. Of the positive aspects of the smartphone, we have that ability to connect ourselves to people that we care about, to connect ourselves to work, the way that we procure a living, the way that we connect ourselves with each other through the internet. There's a lot of danger and difficulties that are wound up in that, and perhaps some people would value chapstick more than a smartphone. But all the same, there's some ordering of value that, at least in the common mind, it would generally be agreed upon that one thing is on a higher plane or level of purpose than another thing. Chapstick, for example, would not be something that's necessary for survival, but maybe flint and steel would. And so that item and the purpose that it satisfies would be higher on that scale. And I'll reiterate here that the scale exists within our experience because of our desire. And it's common in that case because we all desire to continue to live. It's something deeply ingrained within us. But surely it is the case in the history of technology that man finds a way to satisfy certain desires, to meet certain ends, to produce certain things that have a certain productive capacity, that satisfy certain purposes. And the productive spirit would be something entirely diminished if it were evil. The productive capacity, if at all, that the evil person has is temporary and a means to an end, to deceive and to obliterate. So it would seem in this way, because of the fundamental belief of the evil person, again that tends towards absence, that judgment is something of a useful tool towards that end of nothingness. And that true judgment, when it meets that point at which evil can no longer continue a productive, that's not the right word, they can no longer continue a truthful relationship. It can no longer use the tool of judgment to differentiate between things. What is above and below is eventually the same. In the end, it is nothing to them. And attention, what attention in the end? But a broken, discarded, chaotic mess of mind. Awareness brought to zero. And how can one make any sort of judgment under such conditions, or with such a belief? There's one more thing that I think is most fundamental. It has to do with what I had just said about using judgment, about coming to a point where the end is all-consuming. But there's something fundamentally missing here. And this has to do with that fundamental misunderstanding of judgment. The question can be raised, well, where is that misunderstanding? If the evil person is to use it only temporarily until the full gravity of their beliefs are played out into total absence, whether that be in suicide or death because of their participation in the purposes that they find valuable, or it be because what we would deem to be evil is something that is of a fundamental concept, difficult to exist independent in and of itself. But it must be a concept to describe the path that it leads towards. And that absence is certainly a thing. Total absence is much more difficult to justify. But temporary absence and destruction of individuals, this sort of thing happens all the time. And of ideas, concepts. But as we live, as we experience, we are not totally one thing or another. We are not totally evil in that respect. We can be on the road until we are not, until our being, our existence ceases. But while we have thought, while we have breath, the evil person, to the degree that a person can be called evil, is unable to understand judgment because that very process by which one comes to form an opinion is defective. It is geared towards the inevitable outcome to destroy any type of decision-making or process of coming to something. And I've mentioned before, the only way that this happens in the evil person is because of some means to an end. It makes sense to them insofar as they wish to justify their end. They become agents that are occupied by some spiritual force. Their ends, their means by which they wish to fulfill their ends are inconsistent. They use the very process by which they seek to destroy. And so, it's necessary, I think, that they only understand, if at all, a portion of it. And only understanding a portion, I should be careful with my words, because no doubt all of us cannot understand judgment perfectly. We can exercise it in more effective ways. But most people, I think, participate in life in such a way that they understand that abandoning such a crucial element of his experience, that of forming judgments, acting on reasonable points of data, being able to articulate with the environment, again thinking about the lip balm situation, as simple as that analogy is, there are just certain things that are so heavily ingrained, innate within us, that the sense of such things, of simple judgments, such as accessing the lip balm, assuming that most of us understand what it is, but once it is understood what the purpose of it is, how to apply it and all that, the sense of its use is second nature. It doesn't require much difficulty to understand it. Now, I do think as the difficulty of something rises, in terms of the amount of effort, reasoning that it would take to understand the purpose of something, I think as that becomes more sophisticated, judgments become more difficult, surely. But in the evil person, and I'd say even in the wicked person, I'll use this expression, which I think is important, on the road. On the road in the sense that it implies that we are in motion in a particular direction. We are not that thing yet, because we have not arrived at that destination, but the evil person, before they are consumed, they are on the road to wickedness, they are on the road to evil. They believe that the direction that they are going is good. The irony is that they've made a judgment in order to do that. Evil men understand not judgment. If they understood it, they would be going the other way, because on the road, what they are moving towards is poorer and poorer recognition of fundamental purposes and how to integrate them, how to interface with them, only to disrupt and to destroy. And like I said, as that road gets farther out, the misery, the pain, the depth, the confusion only increases. While a sociopath or a psychopath may, in the beginning, seem quite put together, but as the years move on and the mind becomes more and more corrupted, the station of these people, I think, diminishes. I suppose there are exceptions, unfortunate exceptions. But for the vast majority, I believe this is so. But they that seek the Lord understand all things. So in the context of what we had just talked about, and now introducing this new concept of Lord, an interesting thing, an interesting idea, that there's something that we can look for, that we can search for and find. And that thing can lead us to understanding. It can lead us to a greater ability to order things that which are valuable, to identify purposes more readily, underlying mechanisms, whatever. And so what can be said then of this word, the word Lord? Well, much like judgment, we could say that it is a process. It is a way in which we come to understand all things. But of course, we all understand at some level that the concept of God, the concept of Lord, is much larger than that. It is larger than just a tool to be used for selfish and individual purposes. How do I interact with the very thing that caused me to be? Well, I can certainly interact with my parents. And often, surely it is the case that God is referred to as the Father. And there has to be some way in which that fundamental relationship between a person and their parents that is represented within that relationship between man and God. Other than the fact that this source, whatever it might be, has caused all things to be. It has this way of participating with us that is meaningful, that is not necessarily arbitrary, although the concept of arbitrary is something that exists. It is something that we will experience. It is something that will lead us to confusion. But just because it exists does not negate the fact that orderly things exist. It does not negate the fact that one can find themselves in a more pleasant disposition, in a way that more effectively chooses to order their surroundings, to understand their environment, to understand things, to understand their relationships, to understand themselves, and to order such things appropriately so that they can maximize their understanding. And what they are seeking in all of these things, I think, is something common among them all. Coming to understand, making appropriate judgments based on our observations, but also including our experiences in our judgments. these put us on the road towards God, towards goodness, towards that relationship. In the end, much like this evil situation, I think one truly comes into contact with this sense of truthfulness of contact with either of the absolutes. I think may possibly rest outside of the mortal experience, but it is not outside of his ability to understand and to fortify his position as he finds himself existing in this material landscape. Now, there's another angle that I would like to approach this from. There are certain things that we can say that surely we will all understand is true. If I ask or propose the question, is it possible to understand all things? If by all things I mean understand the way in which every single thing works, the way in which every single thing is ordered, both from the macro perspective but also from the micro perspective, to understand every person's thought at every moment, to understand exactly what to say in every situation, to understand what exactly the highest virtues are, how to order them, exactly what it means for something to be good. There are many things that a person can know, and many things a person can understand, but all of them, at least in this context, I think is impossible. And I think it would be reasonable not to go down that road for interpreting this verse. Understanding all things, I think rather has more to do with, much like the conclusion that we came to with judgment, the judgment is more of a process, a procedure. Understanding is that process and procedure. But what is a thing? I suppose we should ask. Google defines it as an object that one need not, cannot, or does not wish to give a specific name to. Personal belongings or clothing, equipment, utensils, or other objects used for a particular purpose, anything, used for emphasis, used to express one's disapproval of or contempt of something. All that can be described in the specified way. An inanimate material object is distinct from a living sentient being. An action, activity, event, thought, or utterance. Thingness, in other words, occupies such a broad and vast landscape. A landscape is a thing. Such a broad aspect of our experience that everything seems to be a thing. And that in the context of evil, we are talking about that road or that process again by which thingness disintegrates. Such a lofty thought. But the thought of thingness in and of itself, and considering all things, I think there's a level at which one can understand all things as it pertains to thingness without necessarily having to understand the individual bits for which we all understand that it would be impossible to order all of that and retain all of that information. Now, this is no simple matter, and I can't claim to, in this instant, understand exactly how this verse plays out. I find myself thinking that it is unlikely that a person would find themselves in life in perfect union with God, but just varying degrees, varying levels of enlightenment or sophistication and ordering of purposes. For the human being is a fallen being. The human being is not a higher creature. The human being is capable of a lot. The human being can transcend. The human being has the mind that is in the image of God. So this consciousness, this self-awareness, this agentic quality, I think, is all a precondition towards setting up this verse. They that seek the Lord understand all things. In my experience with religion, trying to find God, perhaps finding Him in certain places, perhaps losing Him in others, for my striving, I can say that when I know that I am closer to God, that I am participating with life rightly, I feel that the concept of existence is easier. Or rather than easy, perhaps I should say that it makes sense. It's more understandable. I'm not sure existence for me is ever all that easy, but at least I'm able to order myself in such a way that it makes it manageable, understandable, that I could stand in the face of it and admire and come to know, because I have this commitment to that process. I know that there is truth to be found, and I know that there is substantial, purposeful truth to be found. Better is the poor that walks in his uprightness than he that is perverse in his ways, though he be rich. So, this poverty, it comes up often in the Proverbs. There are ways in which we could think of poverty at many different levels, at just outside of material gain and wealth, but it's likely that what we are referring to here is that type of experience, having stuff, having material goods, owning land, etc. And this may include positions of authority or of power. Better is the poor that walks in his uprightness. So here I'd like to explore what it might mean from a practical standpoint to walk in uprightness. Now, if I say that I walk in shoes, or I walk in a building, I walk in anything, thinking about a physical space, thinking about that physical action of walking. Let's start here and then expand it out symbolically. Thinking about a space that is large enough to walk into. Let's say I walk into my room. I can be walking in my room back and forth. What does that mean? Eventually, this becomes something that is a little bit more purposeful and meaningful. Why would I move from one room to another. Surely there must be some purpose to do so. And the fact that I am in a building, there must be some purpose for that. Usually, we do not just arbitrarily find ourselves in places. Eventually, as I've said, if it is without purpose or without cause, we will find ourselves in some environment or some place for some reason, whether it be something as fundamental as survival or something as trivial as personal enjoyment. But if we take a simple example, a building, let's say the building that I live in, it is not strictly a house, although I call the place that I live a home, but the building contains many different segments. We can think about the outside of the building, and then that interesting point, that threshold. The threshold has a purpose. The sidewalk has a purpose that leads up to it. The purpose of the threshold is so that we can participate with the building, that we can enter into it. We enter into it such that we are going somewhere. Perhaps in the simplest of cases, we want to get out of the elements, so we go inside of something. In the case of my building, however, I enter the building because I know my home is there somewhere, even though it may not be in the place that I initially enter. I may enter into a hallway which has a purpose to lead me somewhere. I enter into the elevator which has a purpose to take me somewhere higher. I exit the elevator to a different hallway. That hallway, yet its purpose is to bring me to some other place. I find myself at a new threshold, the threshold now between the hallway and my home, something far more meaningful, purposeful than that first threshold from the outside to the inside. As I enter into my home, there are other spaces. There are other things that I can interact with for different purposes. The bathroom has its own purpose, the kitchen has its purpose, my bedroom has its purpose. Now, in this way, I want to be thinking about uprightness, that it may be this multi-layered experience, much like this building that I am talking about, that we may find ourselves in varying degrees of participation with this uprightness, all of which is meaningful, but it requires that prudent mind to find the next place, or to find the place of uprightness that fits our desire to a degree, but purpose maybe more specifically, much like the way in which we go to a particular room for a particular reason. It's a dedicated space, a dedicated reason, a dedicated concept. So speaking now specifically of the word uprightness, before we do so, I want to say that today is a new day. A new day, new thoughts. On this day, what I want to begin this episode by thinking about before we get to uprightness is the general path, the upward, or the inclination that we all must endure in order to get where we wish to go. And in life, I've lived, I think, a sufficient amount of it now to understand that that journey to get somewhere true, somewhere meaningful, somewhere impactful, it's never usually as it seems. There are a few rare exceptions. Eventually, I think the desires are satisfied at some point on that road, but it's fraught with difficulties. There's everything in the way. There are numerous obstacles to be surmounted, things we did not expect feelings we do not enjoy, a certain sense of tediousness and anxiety about the approach, about the pace, about our intent. But if we persist, eventually that environment turns from something that is hostile into something that is productive and fruitful. Now, in terms of this uprightness, there are a few different words that come to mind. First, I think about something being erect, in the sense that it is standing upright, whether that be a physical posture or, in this case, a moral one. There's the idea of straightness. We have the words up and right put together. Up is an interesting term in the sense that it affords us, I think, a few different things to consider. We can begin with the physical analogy of things, but quickly we have to delve into, integrate into that symbolic domain, more of the meaningful domain. And this up, I think, refers to a set, it refers to a category, it refers to the ordering of things that are valuable. It refers generally to the idea that there is this hierarchy of things that are considered to be valuable or good. And that if we start from a particular place and we go up, the place that we have gotten to, this place is now considered to be better than where we were before. Now, not always in a physical sense. If you ascend in elevation, are you in a better place, of course. But this is not really the productive way to interpret this. Up is this, in my mind, I'm thinking about, since I began with speaking about the struggle up the inclination, I think about Sisyphus and his experience of pushing that boulder up the hill continuously as part of his prison sentence. And how exactly does one justify their existence if their life is but a series of these events where they must push this large, heavy, difficult experience up the incline, only for it to roll down the hill and to start again from a different perspective, or truly start again if something has happened in life, such a disruption has occurred that one must transform and reinvent. And I think it happens to be in a matter of the way in which we see things. Every time we go up that hill, every time we are accepting that responsibility, we are not undertaking something that is fruitless, pointless, repetitive, and meaningless. We are undertaking something that is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to achieve. And in this sense, regardless of what it may seem to another about our strivings and pushing that boulder up the hill, that sense of up will be apparent to us if we choose to accept it. And such a sorry thing it would be not to learn from our strivings and our sufferings. A drug addict, for example, they have many strivings and many sufferings. They overcome serious psychological pitfalls. They recover from it only to fall severely back into the darkness. This is a Sisyphean nightmare in the negative sense, that what they have chosen is not that productive path, the path at which they accept responsibility, but rather the path of that inner torment and suffering, where the battles are about finding a baseline, and that their up is digging themselves out of a trench, out of a hole, only to be satisfied for a moment with the breath of fresh air and of sobriety, quickly to be disturbed by it, to fall back down that path, the descent into the darkness, as I've said. But as we move into the second part of this word, up and then rightness, this provides us with a particular orientation. Many things can be up. In an observational standpoint, if I take my physical body, there are plenty of anatomical terms that we can use to describe the body. We can say that something, in terms of up, we could say something that is more proximal to another. We could say that it is superior to another. Proximal and superior don't necessarily mean the same things. But in an oriented way, they find a similar convergence in a way. If I'm standing tall, what is up is my head. Now, what is right about my posture? Well, upright is a position that is arbitrary only to a degree, but in the degree that it is not, it refers to that position of maximal attention. It is not something that is associated with lethargy. It is not something that is associated with a lack of attention. Standing upright, having our posture correct, and the appropriate erecting muscles engaged. This is a position, a posture, a perspective, an orientation that is purposeful. It is ready for action. Now let's say that we take this uprightness and we envision it as a room, as we did earlier when talking about walking within something and the various purposes that were described about the building that I live in. So if we take uprightness, a quality, an environment, a mental environment in this situation that everybody has, that everybody is capable of, and we say, walk in that uprightness. Well, we can begin in a rather adolescent way. We'll find ourselves in this analogy of the building, that physical domain. Now, walking in this case does not necessarily imply, although it can, physical action. Physical action at a distance, because what is wound up in this physical action is purpose and meaning. But nonetheless, being inside, engaging with, understanding the order of those purposes, understanding when to do something, where to be, how to execute. All of these require a particular posture of mind. It includes morality, but in the most general of senses, it includes the three things that I mentioned: position, perspective. Orientation, I think, can be seen as a synonym to a degree as perspective. But orientation, I think, in a more fundamental sense, can be the way in which the mind is oriented to reality, which has a lot of underlying fundamental factors, not least of which is how we were raised. And so if we imagine that this building is now the potential for our uprightness, it can be however small or however large we choose it to be. And that point, I think, is important, the choosing for it to be. It is a matter of will that we walk in this uprightness. And yet it is a difficult thing, but a profoundly curious thing, to think about the implications of that most meaningful physical space in our lives. Right now, just to paint the picture, I'm in my bedroom. It happens to be in the low 20s in Fahrenheit outside. I have this small electric heater that is running. My room is quite toasty at the moment. I have two lights on, and they form this sort of ambient experience. One light is shining upon an image that's on my wall, sort of a scientific image. Speaking of anatomy, it is an image of the muscular system, of all the various muscles in the body, dissected and labeled. To the left of that image, there's a painting, a Salvador Dali painting. This painting is a bit of an abstract piece. It doesn't really make any sense. In front of me I have a bookstand upon which the Bible sits. It is open to Proverbs chapter 28. I have a small reading light that extends in a semicircular manner over the book, opens into two prongs, and that LED light that shines from it illuminates the Bible. And it happens to have various settings on it. It's at level 2 in terms of its brightness. And as I look away from this immediate section at my desk, the room, as I move away from this central place, the central experience, it becomes darker. Not shrouded in darkness, but darker, in the sense that in the periphery, my attention is just not there. It doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to be at my bed. It doesn't need to be at my bookcase. Right now it needs to be here, in front of this microphone, and thinking about this verse. Now I ask the question, in this situation, am I walking in my uprightness? Quite difficult to draw a parallel between analogies. For in the first, I'm talking about this building with its varied purposes that are within it. We just got done talking about the word up, and that it implies a vertical that is a hierarchy of value, a hierarchy of goods, or a hierarchy of purposes. Rightness, which is a matter of orientation. It is a matter of goodness, surely. It is a matter of attention, and it is a matter of goodwill. So in the sense that I participate, from my perspective, because it has to be, in the sense that I live intimately in this space, in this room, in this bedroom of mine. In fact, I think it affords a certain perspective, a certain disposition of mind, that I am comfortable here. As I've said, it's a warm environment on a cold day. The sun has set. I'm in the tail end of a work week. Tomorrow is a work day. I wake up in the morning. All of these factors are playing into my orientation, my disposition, my perspective. And yet here in this moment, what needs to happen is an intense reflection. That if walking within something is akin to navigating a physical environment to find the end for which my desire is directed, to walk in uprightness is to find that end, to find that purpose that is actually good. And also, within that Sisyphean example, for which we can see it as, on one hand, a blessing that we have the opportunity to undergo such experiences and to experience suffering and to try to grow and learn as we go through life and as we pay attention. But it can also be seen in an unfortunate light that it is meaningless, purposeless, and overall pointless. I think in the manner that we walk in our uprightness, it is a matter of choosing the former. It is a matter of choosing things, choosing a perspective, an orientation, that moral posture that extends into physical action, that extends into physical posture. That we are orienting our minds and our attention to that which is most meaningful. We come to understand that which is most meaningful by undergoing experiences, by undergoing challenging experiences. And while we are in those experiences, reflecting on our behavior, modifying them if we can. Hopefully the experiences are of a degree that they extend out in time long enough such that we can come back, modify, repair, rebuild, take down. So I suppose that what's left here is to discuss something personal. It seems that's where it must lead, if this is to be anything of a reflection. So of all of this, of my uprightness, of which I've said we all have this innate potential to find ourselves within that upright corridor, and it is within our power to expand it or to deflate it as we see fit. Again, thinking about Sisyphus. Recently, at work, I have engaged with my superior in a way that I'm very thankful. Not necessarily on the part of my engagement, but on the part of my superior's respect and facilitation of it. It's something of a beautiful quality. Something perhaps that we don't see too often. Or maybe it's just me. I feel that I don't see it too often. But that mutual respect and reciprocation is something that we've decided to put together in a monthly meeting and just to discuss things. And how strange is that? Just to meet 30 minutes every month to discuss whatever. Of course, certain things, most things, are going to be related to our profession. But where the conversations go, where it went, was highly philosophical in nature. And I'm looking forward to that experience. But I say this because I believe that there was a quality somewhere, something that was tapped into, to release that uprightness, so to speak. Maybe releasing is not the right word, but rather my attention was in something. It was in a position. It was in an orientation such that I proposed certain things. And so rather, again, than seeing this as something unleashed, I want to take that, draw that back, and say this is something more that was an occupied position, a willfully occupied position. And to retract even farther from any self-aggrandizement. For the discipline that I am engaged in, I am certainly still in my adolescent phase. And it is more of a mentoring experience that this is going to turn into, I believe. Nonetheless, it affords something. I think it affords the opportunity for me to expand that place of mind for which this relatively poor man, in terms of experience, can shift his perspective and his orientation such that he is within that uprightness of spirit, uprightness of mind, to maximize that potential, that innate potential. Better is the poor that walks in his uprightness than he that is perverse in his ways, though he be rich. So today is a new day, and we've come full circle now. We return to Sunday, on the evening before the work week is to begin. Now I'd like to open my mind a little bit with this session today, and I am thankful for anyone who may find these words. I'm thankful to be here today. And I hope that whatever place the mind may find itself, that if it is a negative place, that we can control, or rather make a decision in that situation to attend to something that will put us on a different path, If the thoughts are good, I'm thankful for that. So we're on the second half of verse number 6 of chapter 28. Better is the poor that walks in his uprightness than he that is perverse in his ways, though he be rich. So this second half, how to begin this. First, I think we may get the most out of this if we expand our definition of what is poor and what is rich. That there are many things outside of the material circumstance that one can be rich in or that one can be poor in. Of these riches, we could think about relationships. We could think about being, richness of presence, richness of attention. And of course, material goods and wealth play into this equation. Often, people that find themselves into a large material wealth are hardworking. Whether or not they come from little money, I think if somebody is to be a head of business, whether it be inherited or merit-based, I think it often requires diligence, discipline to maintain a certain level of material wealth. I suppose there are levels for which this is not really the case, but to give the benefit of the doubt to the person that we may be considering here, this is something that I see often. This is something that I wonder about myself. That our goals, our aims, most importantly our attention that we place towards various ends the tremendous amount of effort that we place, the amount of time that we spend trying to reach our goals, to satisfy our desires. There are many in this society in the year 2025 that I think have found themselves in a rather greedy posture. We face an unknown future. Not that there is a known future, but an unknown future in the sense that it is highly unpredictable. We stand at the precipice. We have major technological revolutions on the horizon. There are major geopolitical conflicts throughout the world. And related to what I'm saying now, we have many institutions and people that are involved in these institutions that facilitate their action. And the scale of these institutions in our societies are so large and so impactful. The movement of these things, transpersonal, often we find ourselves in a posture of unease, discomfort at the idea, at the state of things. We blame institutions, we blame large concepts, ideas or corporate bodies, whatever the body may be, that is filled with various individuals that go throughout their working day, go throughout their lives to satisfy themselves, to achieve something for themselves and for their children. And it becomes a difficult thing. I suppose it always is a difficult thing to examine those aspects of life that are truly worthwhile, and to make those sacrifices that don't, in some way, reduce our moral standing, to know that as we are, as these nodes in a broader network, I think speaking of uprightness from the previous part of this verse, those that wish to be righteous, those that wish to do good, are always in this difficult situation of recognizing, of being disturbed by the slightest inconvenience for which he may feel that his presence in a particular situation, in a particular posture or orientation, may actually in some way lead him, or in fact his participation may, for all intents and purposes, have him participate in something that is entirely contrary to good ends. And I say this not because it's explicitly related here, but I say it because in the broader reflection about those that care only narrowly for their own self-interest or for material gain, a lot of these hang-ups, a lot of the inconveniences that burden the mind do not exist in that perverse orientation. And by perverse, looking at a Google definition of a person or their actions showing a deliberate and obstinate desire to behave in a way that is unreasonable or unacceptable, often in spite of the consequences. And there are plenty of ways in which competition, in a negative sense, can create this culture of obstinate behavior, of a certain type of surrendering and sacrifice for the self, or for perhaps the immediate condition of those around one, such that although their position is elevated, those around them are severely diminished. And if we for a moment unravel this blanket upon which is actually a large map, a territory that indicates to us what our society is, what the identity of our nation happens to be, the complexities therein. as our eyes scan over it and we see the various people participating with one another, building various structures, perhaps seemingly uncoordinated and disparate. The perverse is not an orientation that leads to strong binding. It is not a position of wisdom. It is not although prudence may be involved, it is not a matter of prudence in the long-term sense. It's not a matter of prudence in the sense that this perverse person is not concerned about the structural underpinnings of our society. And these questions are most salient today. As I mentioned, we have many conditions that are in front of us. This mass migration that has occurred in the past 4 years. I've heard reports more than 10 million people have entered into the country. And without making any specific statements about whether or not it is good or bad to have a large number of people enter into a body, I think what we can say about the potential effects are that the underlying identity, the various pillars that hold up that identity, much like pouring water in some concentrated solution to dilute it, we may find ourselves in a similar situation, where the identity itself becomes confused. The body and the boundary, therefore, have difficulty understanding exactly why they are the way they are, what their purpose is. And given such an individualistic culture, of which I think there are merits, and also I think there are unfortunate consequences, but regardless of such an individualized culture, the preservation of a strong unified identity, I think, at times can be sacrificed. And this is what I think about when I think about, at scale, the person that is perverse in their ways and also happens to be wealthy. So we might as well get into something meaningful here, or at least try to before I move on to the next verse. What can I say about my understanding of this term perverse? What can I say about my own experience as I take that metaphorical scalpel and I draw this line? I split open my mind. I look into it and I examine myself. I examine my behavior. I examine my inconsistencies of thought, and at times my difficulty orienting my attention on one particular thing. I think about the way that I participate with those who I care about the most, or I ought to care about the most. And I think about the ways in which I fall short, that I don't put forth an effort enough to say thank you when I should say thank you. That there is always something that can be done to fine-tune a relationship, to add something to it or to take it away, to create a good experience. And I think of my effort in general towards those experiences to be not as up to par or up to standard as they ought to be. But these reflections, I think, dabble very little in that which is perverse. Deliberate, obstinate behavior. I think at this level, this stubborn refusal, I think it could find itself quite entrenched in the self. That for all of the displeasures of life, for all of the inconsistencies of thought that I had mentioned, I have to imagine that there at least is in part some perverse undercurrent that is causing them to sprout and to blossom into something that burdens us. And I think about judgment, I think about fear of God, and I think about the pressure that it can place on a person. If it is not in the mind that it is of God, then perhaps it is just of a floating mind that feels dissatisfied because of inaction, or of his action he does not put forth the effort that he ought. Regardless of that situation, the refusal is this intimate play that I see unfolding in my experience. Just thinking about the past couple days of the weekend, I try my best to have productive weekends, but there are times in which I, for whatever reason, I find myself in this absent state of mind, just difficult to find enjoyment in things. Now, of course, this is nothing that I would say is a state of depression, although it is a depressed state of mind. It is not, conditionally speaking, a depression. And I know how to get out of it. And as a matter of, again, this perverseness, I think what's perverse about the failure in these situations is that the refusal comes in when that part of our mind that is walking in uprightness, in our uprightness, offers the solution. But the weaker part of mind refuses it. It is obstinate in the face of it. And that behavior, sticking with the definition, I think is strictly unacceptable because of what the consequences are, of what it causes us to be. And although we may be rich in certain areas, we may have put ourselves in a certain position, again, a posture, I like to use that word, a certain posture, that maybe we're successful in our business relations, and perhaps our personal relationships are good. But in these moments, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how rich our relationships are. That failure has such an effect, at least on me, has such an effect that may last for some time until the mind finds itself again in that bloom of rigor to put down the sloth and to snap the mind back into attention. And I have to wonder how relatable of an experience this is. And I think part of the reason why I began this, the interpretation of the last part of this verse in the way that I did, thinking about the person that has a goal in mind, but it's not a very lofty goal, despite this person being very disciplined and very successful and having all of the material desires satisfied. It is this underlying deep orientation about those wagers that we make with ourselves within, and of course with others that mean something to us, if we are lucky enough to have such deep and firm connections. The inattentive mind, especially when it focuses on the superficial, again, despite the discipline that may be accompanied, I find it such an unfortunate thing for myself and for anybody else who may experience something similar to get caught in that absence and to get caught in a posture for which they have difficulty connecting to people, have difficulty maintaining their attention such that something meaningful can actually be brought about. And when I say meaningful, I mean good. Good in the sense that a faithful person may understand, or at least have some concept. Good in the sense that we keep it somewhere because we know that it is valuable. We keep it in our minds. We store it in our memory. It is precious. It is a love that is to the highest consensus of the various parts of our mind. It is our conception of God. And the setting of that sun periodically is to my melancholy. But it is also to the blame of my will, that it is not always in front of me, because it is certainly something that I am capable of doing. But I suppose, given grace, that this is the road of the faithful. Struggles are a part of life. Perfection, although we may desire it, is difficult to come by. And all the same, if there is something that plagues us and we can identify it in an honest manner, dip the hand as deep as we can into the mind and pull up that uncomfortable, unsettling thing, and to give it up. I think that makes us better in the long run. Better is the poor that walks in his uprightness, and he that is perverse in his ways, though he be rich. Whoso keeps the law is a wise son, but he that is a companion of riotous men shames his father. So we should be thankful here that we have another opportunity to think about the law. In this chapter so far, we've done it once, I think, already, and that is in verse 4, I believe. They that forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. So we get to do it again here. Another reference to keeping the law. Whoso keep the law is a wise son. But he that is a companion of riotous men shames his father. So this comes at a good time, because I'm currently trying to think my way through the Magna Carta. I've uploaded the first episode already. Before this episode is uploaded, I'll have the second one uploaded of the Magna Carta. But there's this underlying thread that I'm trying to get at, and it's this law of relation. There's the law of man, then there's the law of nature, and then there is the purposeful law of nature, we could say, or the law of God. And I would like to separate out what in my mind at least, when I think of the law of nature, I think of more of the non-purposeful material interactions that are governed by the way that things are from a physical standpoint. And we all have in our minds what these things are. Of course, we live in a physical environment. We participate as such. We feel the effects of gravity. We understand at an intuitive level what would happen if we were to work our way up to a full sprint and then try to stop suddenly. We understand what it might feel like if we fall from a certain height. We have all of these built-in mechanisms that we have learned over time to adapt to our environment such that we don't find ourselves in a precarious situation. Now, perhaps I should make an amendment to what I had said just earlier. When I said governed by, there's a pause there, a pause of uncertainty. Now, the answer, of course, is God, but there's a way in which I think the modern mind, separates out that non-purposeful material, the objective world, from that of the subjective. And the subjective has been defined as this domain that is not trustworthy, but also it includes everything that we find to be meaningful and purposeful. And in the era, the religion of the Common Era, that is where all of it rests. That nature has no part in this purposeful development. It is not. It is only within the mind of man that we see it, or perhaps within the animal kingdom, biology, whatever. But the belief that it is in any way more expansive than this in our reality is, for the most part, denied. And I think it's denied because of a lack of evidence, but whatever the case is, and when I say lack of evidence, I mean to say that people give themselves to their reason at the expense of their faith in the modern age. And now this is coming from a faithful person, just for context. The law is a tricky thing, and to keep it even harder. We can say that of the law, that we can or cannot do something, but the understanding of the truthfulness of a law again, I think, is no simple matter. We could think of divine law. We could think about the Torah, think about the Ten Commandments. We could think about the moral laws. We could think about various social and civil law. There's a certain anxiety that I have about interpreting law, getting it out of a broader context for which we have no firm basis for understanding. Of course, it is no excuse because of the vastness of things and interrelatedness of things that we ought not to govern ourselves and to pay attention to where we are governed by something outside of us. But all the same, there is this fear of it. Whoso keeps the law is a wise son. I think what is likely referred to here is what we can consider the established law. Law that has endured throughout generations. Restrictions placed on action that lead us to positive outcomes. We avoid those negative pitfalls for which man is so exposed to. Within this fear that I had mentioned, there is also a hunger, maybe not within the fear, but in tandem there is a hunger for the realization of some true law, something that is dependable, something that I can return to. Keeping a law, I suppose, becomes second nature when it is integrated into one's experience. I think about the various types of people that I have met in my life. I think often there are these repeating patterns of personalities that one comes across. And in my experience, there are these types of people that are just sort of genuinely dependable. They are oriented in such a way that their participation with experience, with life, seems to be somewhat seamless. Not to say that they don't have struggles, we all do. But it's always a blessing to come across somebody that seems to have their ducks in a row, their life not necessarily together, but their orientation to God, perhaps, in a broader sense to law. They seem to have that implicitly understood, ingrained in them, or by their part, on their part, they actively pursue that righteous law. And it shows. It shows in their actions and their behaviors. But I'd like to take some time and talk about the word wise, for we are being set up here for a good definition, I think. The examination of law is important to this definition. Now, outside of any potential insecurity about the knowing of law, a wise person may come to know law through experience. They may have broken it at some point. Breaking a law, I think, is surely, and being judged accordingly, I think, is surely a good way to understand exactly why it is a law in the first place, what it prevents, what exactly that transgression looks like and what it means. Moreover from that, the type of transgression that is sincerely, honestly reviewed, and the person that has this introspective experience after being shown true judgment, that comes to accept and agree with that judgment, and I mean truly agree with it, not just see the reason behind it, but truly in their heart agree with it, must be a person that's on the road to wisdom, if they don't gain but a sliver of it in that experience. And the reason I say that, there's something quite powerful about our experiences. There's something quite powerful about certain types of experiences, the types of experiences that we are really paying attention to. Perhaps we fall into them at a certain point in life, and they stick with us for whatever reason. But true honesty, I think, is sometimes difficult to come by. And all too often, we play the part because we have to. And sometimes playing the part gets us by until a certain level of authenticity and sincerity will find us, and our heart and our reason will be in line. But fatigue tempts us otherwise at times. But again, referring to those cases for which the understanding but also the integration of law, of understanding it by experience, again through possibility of transgression, can happen through reason, I suppose. It can be passed down through a story. Wisdom, as I've often described, or often have used in my definitions, there has to be a certain element of wisdom, of the wise person, that understands binding, that understands how things relate to one another in a positive sense. And being able to examine law at the level of binding is quite important. As I've mentioned, I've been studying the Magna Carta. And this is a period in which law is transforming between two classes of people. The civil authority and the baronial class, which there's this interweaving among them, of course, but that idea of reintegration, of maintenance, of order under changing tides. This is an experience that in the attentive mind will lead to understanding. It will lead to wisdom. Whoso keepeth the laws is a wise son. Perhaps because the son listens to the father is passing down this law. But the son that keeps the law is firmly established. The pillars of righteous behavior are instilled in this person. Their care for since we're speaking of this person in terms of a familial relation, their care for relations in a like manner is bound by duty, obligation. But he that is a companion of riotous men shames his father. Now, what is the fundamental qualities of these riotous men? What makes them the way they are? The first word that comes to mind is impulsivity. Inability to control or direct one's emotions. And the barbarousness, I think, that accompanies an uncontrolled heart, in which the desires are spread to any number of wants. And given a lack of constraint, the unfortunate behavior follows. What I find interesting here is the connection the connection that we can say is a type of a perverse type of binding, where in the first part of this verse we were talking about wisdom in the sense that a strong definition of wisdom contains the positive version or positive vision of binding, whereas with the shame there is a similar aspect in which one is bound to another. In the case of the Father and the Son here, they are surely still bound to one another, but in a negative sense. This is like the contrary point of wisdom, that of shame, dishonor, humiliation, failure. What interests me, I suppose, is how the pull of one heart can lead to the pull on another. And again, in this way, I see that binding force. But this binding force is nothing good. It's not an elevatory force. It is a detracting force. It draws the Father in only to hurt him. Only to give that sense, only to give that part of him that is esteemed, that has integrity, poison, to disable it, to bring it down. Following the lowly brings low, brings the mind low, brings the heart low. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'll continue next time with verse 8 of chapter 28 of the Proverbs.